So I just want to add on here to the video that you're about to watch that this is information that I've already covered. If you look back to video number 10, I covered this idea of Ernst Haeckle and recapitulation already, but it didn't do it so much from the textbook, but as a rebuttal to some of the things that were presented in the board meeting. So you're definitely going to see a repeat of a lot of that information, but here we're seeing it from the perspective of what the textbook is actually teaching. So it spends those 2 full pages talking about recapitulation and alluding to it as one of the evidences for evolution. So I know this looks like some similar information to what you may have already seen if you've been watching earlier videos, but this is from the perspective. This is the different perspective. It's from the perspective of the textbook actually teaching it, as opposed to just me generally rebutting what was going on during the board meeting. So I hope you enjoy. Welcome back. We are going to be continuing our discussion of the Clay County Biology textbook and the errors that it contains. Today is a bit of a whopper. It's in a way one of my favorite discussions because it's kind of easy pickings in a way, and it's good because it's easy to show this one even to people who don't really understand the more in-depth problems that we have been discussing with the fossil record and some of the other things where you get a little bit technical from time to time. But this one is pretty obvious. The really silly part of this is it takes up a big section here. We start on page 299, but we're going to actually cover 300 and 301 to deal with something that is on, if you get down into it, you understand it is a flat out lie. So the textbook is perpetuating what has not just that people who are against evolution know is a lie, but everybody knows it's a lie. The evolutionists themselves have discarded this in the professional realm, if you will, but it's still in our textbooks. And I don't even understand why they continue to include it in the textbooks, because it's a lie that was exposed a long time ago. In fact, it was exposed right at the moment that it was told, in fact, and yet they still perpetuated it for over 100 years, and they're still perpetuating it in the textbooks. So we're going to cover this today. This is commonly known as recapitulation. Here in the textbook, they kind of get away from that technical term a little bit, and they get into they use different words. So the title of this section is called Developmental Similarities, and I'm going to read a little bit of it. I'm going to skim over a couple of sections because they're based on it, but they're trying to get very specific with it. We'll touch on those because I want to be thorough, but the section really is built on the work of Ernst Haeckle and his idea of recapitulation. So let's talk briefly what that is, and then we'll get into what the text says. Recapitulation is the idea that from a single-celled organism at the moment of conception to the point of birth, every living thing undergoes its evolutionary stages from single-celled organism to multi-celled organism to fish to amphibian, and then on to whatever it becomes, bird or mammal or whatever. And so you can retrace the evolutionary history of an organism by looking at its gestation period. And that was his idea, and that was the art that he drew. He was a very talented artist. If you look at a lot of his drawings that aren't necessarily scientifically based, he was a prolific artist. He was very good at what he did, and part of the reason that I think that he got away with including his material in a lot of textbooks and got away with convincing a lot of people. And on top of that, a lot of people wanted to believe what he was promoting and what Darwin was promoting. He was contemporary with Darwin. So I'm going to read the section, and then I'm going to discuss it. I'm going to show why this is absolutely not as the chapter suggests, evidence for evolution. I don't even know why it's included in here because of the way that it's presented here. So, developmental similarities. A study proposing a relationship between barnacles, which are fixed in place as adults, and crabs, which are mobile at all stages in their life cycles, fascinated Darwin. Darwin collected specimens of barnacles over many years of research. In making his, and this is page 300 now, in making his observations of these crustaceans, he noticed, as shown in figure 4.3, that although adult crabs and barnacles are significantly different, their free-swimming larvae are very similar in appearance. These observations formed an important part of Darwin's evidence for common descent. See here, we're talking about evidence. This is what they're claiming to be evidence. Darwin thought that because the little baby crabs and the baby barnacles were similar, this showed common descent, and that's the heart of evolution, is common descent. Okay, so then he talks about three different parts here: the notochord, the dorsal nerve cord, and the pharyngeal arches, and we're going to focus on those pharyngeal arches. In the same fashion, embryos of vertebrates share many similar characteristics. For example, the embryos of fish, birds, reptiles, and mammals all have a flexible support rod in their backs called a notochord, for which the phylum Chordata is named. Primitive chordates, such as the fish-like lancelet, keep their notochords throughout their lives, while in the vertebrate, the notochord develops into part of the vertebral column. All right, so that's what they're saying, is that there's this similarity in development, whereas the lancelet it stops. It doesn't go further in the development stage, where other creatures that have a backbone or a spinal cord, they develop it further and it becomes part of the full spinal column, a more developed thing. And so they're saying that there's more complexity or an ongoing evolution that happened, and that's why during our development we look like we have the same notochord, but then we eventually develop that during later part of our gestation into a backbone and a vertebra. And so that's one of the examples they give. The dorsal nerve cord. Within the notochord of both the lancelet and embryonic vertebrates lies a hollow nerve cord that runs along the dorsal or back side of the animal and extends into a flexible tail. We're going to talk about that in a second. Many vertebrates retain their tails as they develop a bony axial skeleton. However, in human embryos, the tail generally absorbs into other tissue prior to birth. In extremely rare cases, human babies are born with a short tail made of soft tissue, but the majority of humans only have a tail bone, the coccyx, at the end of the spine that does not extend to the outside. All right, I will come back to that. I want to talk about, but I want to finish reading this first before I get into it, because I want to make sure I'm covering this whole section here. All chordate. This is the pharyngeal arches. All chordate embryos have 6 structures known as pharyngeal arches, separated by slits. The upper arches develop into structures of the face, ears, and jaws. In adult fish, the 2 lower arches become the gills. However, in humans, the 5th arch disappears, and the 3rd, 4th, and 5th arches develop into the nerves, bones, and other structures of the throat. The similarity of features in vertebrate embryos shown in figure 4.4 has been subject of controversy since the late 1800s, when Natural History of Creation was published by German scientist Ernst Haeckle. A great follower of Darwin's theory, Haeckle maintained that the stages of development found in vertebrate embryos reflected the stages of evolution for each of those organisms. Well, that's what they were just arguing in those prior 2 sections here. So they're still arguing. It's not new information. Those 2 sections that I read before about the notochord and the development from fish to man, those weren't new and distinct from what Ernst Haeckle was arguing. They're part of what Ernst Haeckle was arguing. This became known as the recapitulation theory and was stated as ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. And that's what it's talking about, is the phylogeny. You're dealing with the idea that your gestation period, the way that it looks, the way that it appears to be, is repeating that ancestral history of what your biological ancestors went through during their developmental evolution. And so that's what those words are talking about. His book and its accompanying drawings, which were borrowed and adapted from vertebrate anatomy experts of the time, immediately drew criticism from those who disputed evolutionary theory. See, they're putting it into terms of, oh, well, those guys were anti-evolutionists. That's the phrasing that they're going for here. Despite this, for many years, Haeckle's drawings commonly appeared in textbooks throughout the world. When photography became more widely used, some scientists pointed out discrepancies. That's a tiny word. It's a discrepancy in size and scale between Haeckle's drawings and photographs. Other scientists argued that Haeckle openly stated in the captions of his drawings that he deliberately reduced them to similar sizes to enable observers to make comparisons. Although Haeckle revised and added new evidence with each of the 5 editions of his book, his reputation never recovered from the accusations of fraud. We'll cover that. His recapitulation theory is no longer under serious consideration by scientists, except for apparently those who wrote this book. With today's technology, scientists have shown that all vertebrates have a set of very similar genes, which is a totally different thing. Genetics and the way that you're talking about genotype versus phenotype. Genotype is what the genes look like and how they express. Phenotype is what they look like. So a phenotype would be wings, or phenotype would be gills, or phenotype would be a backbone. Phenotype would be, does a person have blonde hair and blue eyes, or does a person have brown hair and brown eyes? Those are phenotypes. It's their appearance. And for a long, long time, biology was restricted to phenotype because we didn't know what genes were. We didn't know anything about them. Later on, when genes were discovered, genotype became a very much more specific thing. And genotype and phenotype, the looking at a creature versus actually understanding its chemical direction based on its genes are 2 completely different things. So in this section, they have a small paragraph at the very end. They try to cross over the 2, and when they do that, it is conflating 2 completely different ideas in order to kind of salvage this hundreds of or 100 years, many decades, multiple decades, over 10 decades worth of flat out lies. So anyway, with today's technology, scientists have shown that all vertebrates have a set of very similar genes that direct the development of body structures from a basic body plan. These genes, the Hox genes, are discussed in more detail in the chapter Invertebrate Diversity. Evidence as this suggests, there's one of them words, suggests that vertebrates and other organisms evolved from distant common ancestors. See, we're not in science anymore. We're in suggest and might be and maybe and it's possible and whatever. Well, science is about knowing. If you are a scientist, your purpose is to know. And this goes back to earlier videos where I've talked about that, where they get away from knowing, where we're talking about scientific laws, and we're getting into this idea of reasonable confidence, or we think this could possibly be the right answer, or this is the most likely answer. Well, guys, that's not knowledge. That's not knowing anything. So anyway, and then they show something very similar to, at the very bottom of page 301, they show something along the idea that Ernst Haeckle drew from. This is not his charts, but it shows a human, a pig, and a chicken embryo, and it shows the pharyngeal arches, the notochord, and the alleged tail. Now, I'm going to cover those things because they're still flat out lies. They're not what they claim that they are supposed to be. In the humans never have a tail. The dorsal nerve cord does not extend into a tail at the end. That's not what that is. When you look at the spine of any animal with a tail, the tail does not contain part of the spine. It doesn't contain the spinal cord, which is part of the central nervous system. The brain and the spinal cord are essentially the central nerves of the rest of the body. Well, the tail doesn't contain the spinal cord. The spinal cord is contained in the vertebrae to protect it. if you put part of that spinal cord in the tail, you've got a portion of the lower spinal cord in these animals that is completely and totally unprotected and mobile in a highly elastic environment where the tail can just kind of whip around and do all kinds of things and whatever, where the spinal cord is supposed to be relatively rigid. Yeah, we can bend our backs. We do have a range of motion, but that range of motion is limited. And basically, kind of how we walk upright, or how an animal keeps straight. There's a limitation. You can't take a cat and twist its back legs all the way around. There's a limitation. Yeah, they're pretty flexible, but there's still a limitation to that because of the backbone. But as for humans, during our embryonic development, we don't have a tail ever. There's no tail. The coccyx is the end of the spinal column, the number of bones that make up the spine itself and protect the spinal cord. And what happens is you have the head and the spine develop first, and then the rest of the body in human development grows and kind of catches up with and grows and protrudes out from and develops around those two things, because those are the center of our body's communication system. They have to grow first. It's like any communication network. You have to build a core infrastructure first, and then from there you can grow out into, let's say, like communities. Like if I had a town, and that town was relatively small, I would build a core communication center there in the center of town, and then everybody that was in the town could have access to it. But then as the outskirts of that town grew, I would create branches that would go out to those, but they would have to be hooked onto that main core. And the same thing, our bodies do that. Our tail does not recede. There's no movement of the coccyx or any part of the base of the spinal cord. What happens is the rest of the body grows around it and forms around it into legs and to buttocks and to all the lower extremities that are never a tail. The tail is a completely different organ in those animals that have tails. And so this is a flat out lie. It's a perpetuation of what Ernst Haeckle tried to show with his drawings, that we somehow have a tail, and that's what they called it. That's why they call it the tail bone. So what is the purpose of the coccyx? Well, again, and I think I've already discussed this in prior videos, the coccyx is it's an anchor for a lot of different muscles that are required for sitting. And when I was born Frank Breech. That was butt first and folded in half, and I bent my mom's tailbone. And to this day, she still has a little bit of trouble sitting down because of that. When you damage that very necessary bone, it can cause problems. And to claim that it's a tail is just it's presenting information to impressionable young minds, which is what we're here for. We're talking about students in the classroom. It's presenting false information to impressionable young minds to get them to think a particular way, to understand things a particular way, which is entirely wrong. And so they're flat out lying about it. It is not a tail. It does not have the structure of a tail. It is no way represents a tail. We never had a tail. And then we get to these pharyngeal arches, these folds in the skin. The folds in the skin were said to be gills by Ernst Haeckle, and they were perpetuated as gills for a very, very long time. I learned about them when I was in biology in high school as gills. So even up into the late 80s, early 90s, they were still calling them gills. Well, they're not gills. There's no structural similarity to them, other than if you kind of look at them, they're little skin flaps. But they don't have the function of gills. They don't have the genetic function of gills. There's nothing in the pharyngeal arches that has anything to do with gills. And to say that they do in humans is again to perpetuate a lie. They have a conclusion. They have this recapitulation idea in mind, And so they say, well, we want them to believe in recapitulation, so we're going to call them gills so that we can talk about the early development of human ancestors as fish, and then later on they develop into something other than gills. And that's just not what the evidence suggests at all. There's nothing in the evidence anywhere that says that those folds have anything to do with gills. Nothing. It's just a flat out lie. It's wishful thinking on their part, so that they can have one of these so-called pillars of evolution. It was shown to be a lie. So that brings us into Ernst Haeckle himself, and I'm going to talk about some of the things he had. He had what he called the biogenetic law, and he and a bunch of his buddies call it that, but it did not actually match up to what we know to be a law. A law is something that has no that is universal in nature and has no known exceptions, or doesn't have the logical possibility for exception. And his stuff was not tested nearly thoroughly enough to be considered universal in scope, and certainly with the proving of it like right away. It wasn't even decades later, like some of the fossils and stuff were proven to be hoaxes or false. It was very, very quick that he was shown to be a fraud and admitted that he was a fraud. And so to call it the biogenetic law, that this idea that we recapitulate our evolutionary history is very arrogant. It is so much hubris. But you have definitely throughout the time that Ernst Haeckle's stuff has been promulgated, people pointing it out over and over and over again, and it still makes it into our textbooks, as you can see from the Clay County textbook. It's still in there. They're still promoting this garbage, this flat out lie, as something that we should even look at. If it's a lie, you should just cut that section out completely. Just delete it from the textbook altogether. Don't mention it, and stop perpetuating his lie. Aaron Wasserman, biologist of City University of New York, declared that the embryo of mammals can never be called a fish, never has anything like a functional gill, and is at all times in its development a mammal. So this guy is a professor at the City University of New York, and he's declaring that Ernst Haeckle's thing was a lie. But here we are still with the biology textbook saying, hey, we had gills at one time during our development, during our embryonic development. Ernst Haeckle altered his drawings to fit his conclusions as a fanatic of Darwin's evolutionary hypothesis, and there was a lot of stuff that came out of that. A lot of racist stuff. If you've ever read The Origin of Species, if you've ever read the writings of Haeckle or Thomas Huxley, I believe is called Darwin's Bulldog. Those guys were absolute racists. The white man is superior to everybody else, and it's shown through biology. It's just a scientific truth, and it's hogwash. Racism is stupid in all its forms, but when you add to it the weight of these scientists, these guys are supposed to be experts in their field. When you add that weight to it, then it just becomes not just stupidity, but just the institutionalized evil, essentially, is the way to look at it. And so anyway, he when he was doing his drawings, he borrowed plates. A lot of his stuff was secondhand. He didn't actually go out and cut animals open to see their embryonic stages. He used these plates, these molds that others had made of the stages of embryonic development. They were later stages, because you obviously can't have the early stages because they're too tiny, a single cell or just a few multiple cells together. Those are too early for him to have any drawings of. So he used the later, like the mid-range to heading towards the late evolutionary or gestational stages to promulgate his evolutionary idea. But when he did it, he lied about it. He used, for instance, one mold for 3 different creatures. He used it for the human, the dog, and the rabbit. And he wanted so much to show that they were similar that he just decided, hey, I'll just draw this 3 times, make some superficial changes, and then I'll promote those as 3 different embryonic organisms, and then people will believe this whole evolution thing. That's how much he wanted that to be believed. And when he did that, he showed that scientists are willing to push their biases, that they have an idea, and they will, in some cases, lie, just outright lie, to push that onto an uneducated, and I don't mean that in a negative way, like, oh, you guys are a bunch of stupid people, you're not scientists. I mean that in these just people who haven't studied it yet, that they look at this and, oh, well, this guy's a scientist. He must know what he's talking about. Look at the detail of his drawings. He really spent a lot of time and effort on this. He really must be correct. And he's using the weight of that reputation to promulgate what he knows to be a lie. He was exposed by Professor L. Rudemeyer of Basel University while he was yet alive. So this was during his lifetime. He was charged with fraud, tried in an academic court at the University of Jena where he worked. And in this trial, he admitted to altering the pictures to better cause people to believe in evolution. He admitted that he felt little guilt in doing so, since hundreds of other biologists were committing the same kind of lie. So he was charged with fraud very quickly, because there's a lot of people that saw his work and knew that what he was promoting was a lie, because they had seen the actual embryos and knew that those weren't pictures of the actual embryos, that they had been altered. He was charged with it. 5 professors from his own university tried him in an academic court for fraud. He was stripped of his teaching credentials, like he was not allowed to teach anywhere anymore. And it pretty much ended his career as a professor and as a scientist, really. So going back to what the biology textbook says, it says that other scientists argued with Haeckle openly, that Haeckle openly stated in the captions. Oh, wait, let's see here. No, that's not it. His book and its accompanying drawings, which were borrowed and adapted from vertebrate anatomy experts at the time, immediately drew criticism from those who disputed evolutionary theory. What does that have to do with it? That's not what he drew criticism for. He drew criticism because he was lying. It wasn't because they disagreed with him on evolutionary theory. This isn't Christians versus evolutionists. This isn't people who are biased against or set against evolutionary, the idea of evolutionary hypothesis. It's these guys are experts in their field, and they saw that Ernst Haeckle was lying about it. They knew that the drawings were faked, charged him with it, and he admitted it. Well, that's not what the textbook says. There's nothing in this textbook that says that, oh, he was convicted of fraud, removed from his position as a professor, and admitted that he lied. He admitted that he lied. That should be in the textbook, but that's not what it is. Oh, no. It's, despite this for many years, his drawings commonly appeared in textbooks throughout the world. Well, that lends him credence. And then some scientists pointed out some discrepancies. There's that little word again. These are discrepancies. No, they weren't. They were flat out lies. And then, although Haeckle revised and added new evidence with each of the 5 editions of his book, his reputation never recovered from the accusations of fraud. Well, that's because he admitted that he lied. Of course, it's never going to recover. I lied to promote a belief without any evidence. And I'm teaching it as if it's true to students so that the lie gets perpetuated. Well, of course, if you're going to keep doing it, 5 editions worth of lies, yeah, of course you're not going to get your reputation back, because you keep going on with a lie. And so why are we now in this textbook, this is the 2018 textbook, why are we still perpetuating the lie? Why don't they come out and say that this isn't evidence of evolution? This is actually one of the places where the evolutionary scientists got it wrong. And not just that they got it wrong, they flat out lied about it. And that's the question I have. But we're still promoting it. So I don't know when this is going to finally bite the dust. We're here now in 2020, and this is still in the textbooks. The most modern textbook that I've encountered was just adopted a couple of years ago in Clay County, Florida, where I used to work, and it's still perpetuating what is outright fraud, outright lies. You could talk about the fossils and stuff like we did before, where there was some hoaxes and frauds in there. Those things are kind of admitted to, and they get really generic with their talk of humanoid fossils and whatever. The horse thing is known to be defunct now, that it's no longer from Eohippus up to Equus to be a straight line. They think of it as branches, and there's just not enough transitional fossils. We can get into the whale thing, the so-called evolution of whales. They thought that the hippo was the closest relative to the whale, and now they've discovered that that's actually not the case. That the closest one is this little kind of raccoon-sized thing that looks kind of like a cross between a rat and a reptile, and it isn't anything like a whale. Like, we're talking the biggest mammal ever to be on the planet. This thing is about the size of a raccoon. When the whale is supposed to have been one of the most well-documented, well-established evolutionary lines through transitional fossils ever made, they change it on a whim from the hippo to this little creature. But this is well beyond that. This is not just speculation and bias. This is flat out lie, and they've got 2 whole pages dedicated to what amounts to a flat out lie. So anyway, able to cover 2 pages today because of that. I'm glad to be able to move forward a little bit, but this is the prime example of a continual promulgation of lies in the textbooks, flat out false. So another reason that I opposed that textbook in the board meeting, another reason that I will continue to oppose a lot of the biological nonsense that is taught. 40% of biology is evolution, and evolution is wrong. It's scientifically impossible. And so 40% of what we're teaching our students in biology classroom is flat out wrong. And so anyway, thanks for joining me today. Feel free to share, subscribe, comment, all those things. And I guess we'll see you guys next week.